Share with me. Tell me something that will save you. Jesus looked at the floor and then looked directly into Pilate's eyes, and he said, for this purpose I have come into the world, to preach the truth. And all those who believe in the truth and seek the truth will hear my voice. Pilate turned, went back to his chair, and sat down once again. He had no answer. He looked at Jesus, he looked at me. He looked at Jesus, he looked at me. He looked at Jesus, he looked at the sky. He looked at the ground. He flicked a rock. And then in all cynicism, what is the truth? Jesus did not answer. In fact, from that moment on, Jesus said not a word. So Pilate sent him out of his court. Now my job as centurion included not only setting the guard and managing my soldiers, and there are many, and some of them are not very smart. My job was also to manage any punishments that were to be inflicted. And so I called for the flagellist, and I called for the cat of nine tails, and I escorted this one Jesus out of Pilate's court. I was amazed as we exited the door and headed for the back courtyard. We had to pass through by the Jews, and the Jews were so inflicted they were ready to kill him on the spot. But I would not allow it, for Pilate had not made a judgment. It was our motive at that moment, honorable senators, to at least get a word out of him, to bring about the truth, the knowledge, and the understanding of who this Jesus was. And in some way, bring about a defense for the man and relieve him from the pressure that was placed upon by the religious Jews of Jerusalem. A riot was nearly to begin. We took him to the court, and we laid him over the pole, tied him, and the whipping began. The cat of nine tails was in use, and as you know, the cat of nine tails is used whenever there is severe punishment to be made. Pardon me, you don't know what a cat of nine tails is, where it's never used on a Roman citizen, so you wouldn't know. It is a short whip, and mixed into the leather of that whip are bones, chunks of bone, pieces of bone, and little pieces of iron, so that when it is laid upon the back is split open. It's a horrible punishment, I admit. I admit that day to administering that whipping to this one, Jesus Christos. 39 stripes he took on his back and upon his legs and across his shoulders. He was whipped. He was beaten. He was left a mere hunk of meat. I am not proud of what I did that day, but I will say this of this one Jesus Christos: he uttered not a word. He uttered no blasphemy. He uttered no curse. He uttered not a word. After his whipping, the soldiers gathered around him and began to mock. And in that mocking, they fashioned a crown made of the nearest thorn bush. And of course in Judea, just as it is with the religious Jews, their thorns are the most thorny bushes I have ever seen. And they laid it upon his head, and they crushed it upon his skull. And then my own soldiers, before I could stop them, began to beat him and buffet him and pull his beard as if he were a rabid dog. Pulled him to the ground by his beard, and there they kicked him, and they spat upon him, and they cursed him, and they yelled out for him to prophesy, for they heard he was a prophet. And still, my honorable senators, this one Jesus never uttered a word. I have never seen such a man. Most men by this time would have wilted, or died, or cried out, or have said some untruth to deliver them, but not this Jesus. Took him back to Pilate's court, and there Pilate washed his hands of the whole matter and said to the Jews, "What should I do with your king?" And they yelled, "Crucify him! We have no king but Caesar." In that moment I felt like Pilate had quailed the crowd, and the riot was over, for they had confessed your Caesar as their king. Pilate issued forth a decree for crucifixion. And Jesus was taken out with a new robe on his back, a purple robe by my soldiers, and a cross was laid upon his back. And he began the journey from Pilate's court off Temple Mount through the streets of Jerusalem. I was amazed at the crowds who had gathered, for the crowds who were around him were a mixture. They were not only the religious Jews who shouted for his death. They were not only the religious leaders and the priesthood who were obviously afraid of the man, but there were many there who had evidently become attached to the man, and there were many who were weeping, for they knew what was coming. I noticed the women, particularly one who they said was his mother, a strong woman. She quietly stood as Jesus passed by, uttered not a sound other than the tears that were flowing from her face and the obvious sobbing that her body was racked with. On he went until he could carry that cross no more. His beating had been so severe. To his knees he fell over and over again. I held back my soldiers from beating him any further. We needed to get him to the hill, to the place of crucifixion. But he could go no further. I pulled a man from the crowd, a man who was obviously a foreigner. I found out later and submit to you that his name was Cyrene. He was a man who had no clue what was taking place. I pulled him in and put him next to Jesus, and he helped this one carry the cross. We took him to a place called the place of the skull, Golgotha, and that is where we always do our crucifixions in Judea. It is right next to Jerusalem's garbage heap, but it's on the crossroads as well, and we use that place to set an example of all who would come and try to cause rioting and rebellion. And that's where Jesus climbed with his Cyrene, Simon of Cyrene, to the hill called Golgotha. There's a place there that is ripe for crosses. We laid Jesus down on the ground and positioned him. And I submit to you that I used the nails of 9-inch, sharp, small, direct. Before we nailed his hands and his feet to the cross, we offered him a mixture of wine and gall. And what, may you ask, is that? That is to numb the pain. And I felt this was appropriate for the amount of persecution he had already gone through, the whipping that he had received. He was in no condition to hang on a cross, and yet he refused and still uttered not a sound. We nailed him. We nailed him. We nailed him to that cross, and then we stood him, beaten, practically unrecognizable to the man that I had first seen. I was amazed as he hung there. The first thing that he did, beginning at 9 in the morning, was to look out on the crowds, and most of them religious Jews, still mocking him, yelling at him, if you were the Son of God, you would come down from that cross. If you were who you say you were, you would come down, and you would speak, and you would come off of that cross. And yet all he did was look at them and shake his head. And in his agony, I heard one prayer as I stepped near to the cross. I heard him say, Father. I thought he was speaking to me, maybe out of blurred vision, but he wasn't. Father, he said, forgive them. They do not know what they do. I could not believe it. In the midst of the greatest persecution, they mocked him, and yet his heart was one of the king, and he portrayed the true mercy of the king. The hours passed. I watched as he put into the charge of evidently one of his followers the care of his own mother. I watched as 2 thieves next to him mocked him. He could get away from persecution by going nowhere. My own soldiers gambled for his robes. Then, later on, as he hung there, suspended between heaven and earth, the land grew dark. I was amazed at how dark it got. I looked to the sky thinking that there possibly was an eclipse, but I